But people can get obsessed. Crazy Eddie, up in Archdale, Virginia, was one of these pickers. He had this network of pickers. This was before eBay and the internet, where Crazy Eddie would buy, remember those catalogs I was telling you about, the Stephen Gray turn of the century editions? He bought a dozen of those. And it was like, sort of like, what's that, the Tupperware stuff, or the Mary Kay stuff, where people buy for you and you, it's a pyramid scheme. And he had the original arts and crafts pyramid scheme. He sat in his house, and this is even before cell phones, but he would send these guys out with these catalogs. And he would say, if you find anything in these catalogs, and he'd write his phone number in the front. He'd say, you call me up. And so they would call him up, and they'd say, okay, page 78, I've got model number 444, how much should I pay for it? Eddie would look at it, and Eddie was pretty smart. He would tell them how much to pay for it. These guys would buy it. A week later, they'd show up at Eddie's, dump their load there in his driveway. Eddie would haul it up on the porch. And Eddie was one of these guys that would be obsessed with shop marks. So he called me up one day about a spindle rocking chair. I didn't have a picture of it, but it looked just like this, but it had rockers. But all Eddie could tell me, he was so excited. He says, Bruce, it's signed twice. It's got 2 signatures on it. It's got a decal in the back, and it's got a paper label. I said, good, Eddie, how's the chair look? He says, it's signed twice. I said, Eddie, yeah, I got you. I said, what's the finish like? Oh, he says, it's good. He says, but Bruce, it's signed twice. Yeah, Eddie, okay, I'll buy it. We got a price, worked out a price over the phone. I went up there. It was signed twice, but it was missing 2 spindles. It had more nails in it than a carpenter keeps in his nail apron. It was a mess. I said, Eddie, you didn't mention this. And he says, oh, Bruce, look at the signature. Eddie, it doesn't matter. Eddie had this horrible, horrible habit. When somebody would bring him a piece, he'd get so excited that he would start calling up his list of arts and crafts dealers and collectors. And the problem was, you know, like, if you didn't return his call, I mean, he'd leave you a message. Bruce, I found this spindle chair, blah, blah, call me back. And he'd hang up, he'd call the next guy. So within an hour, he's called 12 guys. And only one of them is going to buy it. And the other 11 are all upset because they didn't get to buy it. And he'd done this to David Rago several times. David, you know, call David, leave him a message. David called him back and said, oh, I already sold it to Don Treadway, or I already sold it to Jeff Diner, or whatever. And David Rago one time called up Eddie. He said, Eddie, he says, you have my business card? He says, well, not right here, but I have it. He says, well, go get it. So Eddie puts down the phone, goes and gets Rago's business card out of his desk or whatever, comes back and says, okay. And so Rago says, you got my card? He says, yeah, I got it right here in my hand. He says, okay. He says, tear it up. Don't call me anymore. Don't know where it happened, Crazy Eddie. But the problem is, if you put too much emphasis on shop marks, you overlook the real shop mark. Back to our Gustav Stickley chair, and I'm sorry if my camera was shaking a little bit that day. There are ways to identify furniture that don't depend on a shop mark. Things like the corbel. Gustav Stickley had a very consistent style to his corbel. To the best of my knowledge, he's the only one that right here at this point on this corbel, there's a dowel hooking it in. It's just one of those little things. L&JG didn't do it, they nailed theirs on. Stickley Brothers nailed theirs on. Roycrofters, they couldn't figure out what a corbel is, so they didn't use them. Anytime you see a it'll have a little dowel right there holding it on. That's all you need to see. You don't need to see a shop mark. You don't need to turn it upside down. It's going to be Gus. If you want to collect Stickley Brothers or Roycroft, learn the hardware. It's usually very consistent. Gustav Stickley hardware was not cast, it was hammered. You see, I love looking at the file marks on here. Isn't that great stuff? And you know, the hammering around it, wonderful piece. But those are the things, those are the real shop marks. Those are the things you're going to look. The size of the dowels. You would not realize how many different, it's not consistent from maker to maker. Albert Stickley used a different diameter of dowels than Gustav did. And it's a little thing, and you may think it's picky, but if you know exactly what a Gustav Stickley dowel should look like, you will also know whether or not it's been messed with, it's been drilled out, been replaced. So you look at the dowels as well. Should you buy a piece that's been refinished or repaired, or that is in need of repair, Sad story. Lived in Iowa City. I got a phone call from a lady. Back then I used to, I'd run a few ads in the local papers and stuff that I bought that had a Gustav Stickley 4-shelf magazine stand. Described it to me, original finish, signed, great shape, nothing wrong with it. She didn't know what to charge for it. She was just a nice lady, and so I talked with her for a while. I told her what I thought that it was worth, and she said yes, I'll buy it for that. And I said, the problem is I can't get there for about a week. I said, I've got to work, I can get there next Saturday. She said, fine, that's fine, your word's good. I said, you want me to send you a check? She said, no, it's fine. You sound like a nice young man. When I get there, this is what I found. I said, ooh, I thought you said it was original finish. She said, yeah, it was, but you sound like such a nice man over the phone. I refinished it for you.
Oh my God.
Deep breath. Deep breath. Thank you. Gave her the money. Took it back to my shop, and I refinished it again. The damage is done in a first refinishing. One of the other questions I get is, do I decrease the value by a second refinishing? And the answer is no. The value has been lost as much as 50% in that first refinishing. A second refinishing to get it back to that color doesn't really increase or decrease the value. It just gets it looking more authentic, looking more like. And the same thing often happens to metalware as well. The Grove Park Inn, they were, for years, they thought that all that hardware on the Roycroft pieces had tarnished over the years. And so when I arrived on the scene, they were still scrubbing those wonderful big strap hinges with steel wool dipped in vinegar. So the same thing can happen to metalware. And if it goes from the original, this is a wonderful little Roycroft fern dish with a dogwood design, and then the same one that's been polished, you cut the value in half. Can it be repatinated? Absolutely. Can you tell if it's been repatinated? Generally so. It will, just like you can tell if a piece has been refinished. You look closely enough at it, and the way you look is you turn it upside down. That's where, it's like there's no such thing as a perfect crime. There's no such thing as a perfect refinishing. If a piece has been refinished, somewhere on there, there's an extra drip, there's a brush mark, you turn it upside down, you can tell if it's been refinished. How do you identify it? Don't you love this piece? This is just one of those perfect little pieces, and the arch makes that whole piece. Without that arch, it just doesn't have that sophistication and that drama. It's a little drink stand. That lid folds over. It's not split. It's actually, it flips over. It doesn't show up very often. That's an original finish. It shouldn't look perfect. I always get suspicious when I look at something that's got a perfect finish on it, because that usually tells me somebody's wiped it down with a stain rag. And I don't care if it is Minwax. It's the wrong thing to do. I'm very careful when I'm doing the shows and stuff that, we're talking about things you do to new furniture and unfinished furniture, not things you do to antiques. But looking at an original finish is you look closely at it, and oftentimes you're looking for things you don't want to find, like the runs and the drips underneath it. But you look closely at it, you should see good normal wear, and this is what I call a perfect finish. Old enough and worn enough to know that it's original, but yet still quite attractive. And again, you look at that hardware, and you would know that that's Gustav Stickley hardware, because nobody else did hardware that was that expensive. How do you protect your furniture? Question I get a lot. Not because I do a particularly good job of it. I raised 2 boys with mine. I've always got an assortment of cats and dogs around. One time in North Carolina, I went to an antique shop, just dropped in on one. Didn't really expect to see anything in there, but there was this model footstool. You should be able to tell from where you're sitting that that's not the original leather and that's not the original finish. It just doesn't have the look like that last piece has. That's my leather, my refinishing, not a very good job, and tacks are original. But I found that model of footstool that looked like it came out of the crate. It looked like nobody had ever put a foot on it. Original leather, original tacks, original finish, perfect decal. It was like a perfect specimen. And I took it home, and I sat it down, and I just stood there and looked at it. It was just so perfect. Next thing you knew, my cat was on it. And that smell of that dry leather, just boom, those pins came out, and he was ready to go. I drop kicked him about 30 yards across the room. Hit the side of the fireplace and just disappeared. Footstool went into the closet, closed the door. Every couple days I get it out and look at it. Finally one day my wife said, "What is it with the footstool?" I said, "It's perfect. I'll never own a piece that's this perfect." And every time I brought it out, the cat showed up. Because that smell of the leather, he wanted it so badly. And so finally, I really had to make a choice. You know, the cat and the footstool. Kept the cat. Sold the footstool. Sent it off to Christie's. I thought this has to go someplace where somebody has a house that's a museum. You know, somebody would just sit and look at it all day long. So I sold the footstool and went out and bought 2 footstools that had bad leather, bad finishes. I refinished them, put leather on them, and now the cat can do whatever he wants. I put my feet on them. You know, you can spill beer on it, and nobody cares because it's not original leather.
And the cat doesn't touch it.
Yeah, cat. Actually, the cat got run over by a car a week later. It was terrible.
Oh, man, you should have kept that.
Sounds like it's bad karma. Bad karma. How do you protect water rings? You know, one of the questions I have to deal with when I'm down the road with the Minwax people is, you know, they get calls all the time. White rings, black rings. And you probably heard the mantra. White rings are moisture trapped in a finish. If your furniture starts, the finish is wearing out. Finishes don't last forever, especially these old shellac and lacquer finishes. Black rings means the water has sat on there long enough that it's penetrated through the finish into the wood. Black rings are bad. You only get those out by bleaching and sanding. So if you got black rings in your antique furniture, you buy a doily, you buy a runner, you put a plant over it, you don't try to get rid of it. White rings sometimes you can get out with, you know, a little bit of you know, fine oil and some careful wet sanding with some 600 grit sandpaper, but this is starting to sound like a Minwax seminar now. So, but what we want to do is keep that from happening. And what you don't want to do is to put anything on an antique finish other than paste wax. Paste wax. Not beeswax, not liquid wax, no, paste wax. High quality wax. Yes, wax makes one, but so does Johnson, so does Butcher's. You want a high quality paste wax. The best thing you can do. It does not decrease the value of the piece. But if you put a coat of polyurethane over the original finish, you decrease the value. Not as much as if you refinished it, but you still decrease the value. Paste wax is acceptable, and for a couple of reasons. One, it will help repel water and moisture. Not for very long, but it gives you some buying time in case you look across the room and one of your guests has put a drink on your Stickley table. If you've waxed it, you've got 5 or 10 minutes to scoop it up, wipe it off before there's going to be a problem. Also, it can be removed without harming the original finish, and that's what museum curators want to know. They want to make sure that there's no top coat, and it's a carryover from art conservation. They don't want anybody putting a coat of anything over a Van Gogh that can't be removed later if they find that it's doing any harm. So paste wax your furniture, the best thing you can do to it to keep that from happening. This is the back of my non-arts and crafts couch in a west window. You're not seeing a shadow, you're seeing bleached out leather. This is the original color. This is where the sunlight hits it every day. And this is where the windowsill back here is. The sun does more damage than any guests, any dogs, any cats, any kids, because the sun's out there every day. So what are you going to do? If you got a valuable piece of furniture, it's got an original finish on it, move it. Get it to the other side of the room. Rotate your furniture. Even indirect light will slowly bleach out the color on a leather top table. Never leave things sitting on top of a table in one place for more than a few weeks before you move them around.